So here we are again with another episode of the briefing room, and today we are talking to historian Anthony Tucker Jones. Welcome to the briefing room,
Hi, John. Thank you very much for having me on.
and we're going to be talking about your book, The Secret War, which, as we discussed before recording, is like an almanac of all the organisations from all around the world, and that was really interesting.
Yes, as a historian, I'm a great believer in context. Whenever you're looking at a subject, it's always really good to look at what's either side of it, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
because it gives it context. And with the Secret War, everyone always thinks espionage and spies, but actually, there's a lot more to it than that. And what fascinated me was this. Where military historians, we're all familiar with the land war, the air war, and the ground war. But actually, there's a fourth element to it, and that's the war that's going on behind the lines all the
Mhm.
time. And that involves an awful lot of elements. What I tried to do was sort of distill it into this book as sort of a general introduction, if you like,
Yeah.
on the different aspects. So, it covers espionage, it covers eavesdropping with places like Bletchley Park, it covers the spies, it covers the sort of secret technological side of things. So, sonar and radar, of course, very important. And then likewise, people tend to treat the resistance and the partisan wars as something sort of almost separate, unrelated. But again, that's part of a secret war that's going on behind, access lines throughout the entire length of the war. Really,
Yeah, I don't think any war would would be won without that element.
no. And I think military historians, they like everything to be sort of neat and tidy almost. So if you're looking at a battle, it'll be a L'Alamein. If you're
Yeah.
looking at Arnhem or whatever, it tends to focus on a certain element. But of course, what you don't realise is what's going on around the edges. So, for instance, another element that I cover in the book, albeit quite briefly, is the art of deception.
Mhm.
And deception is enormously important during the Second World War and plays a key role at certain fundamental junctures of the Second World War. An example of that, we can go and discuss it a bit more later, perhaps, but an example of that is Al Alamein, the sheer amount of deception work that went on behind the scenes
Mhm.
to dupe Field Marshal Rommel into believing Montgomery was going to attack somewhere else than his actual intended target. And again, something like D-Day, again, it's
Yeah.
elaborate supporting deception operations that go on to convince the Germans that there might be landings in Norway, or there might be landings in Brittany, or there might be landings north of the Seine because that would be the most logical place to land because it's nearer the Ruhr. So there's all
Yeah.
these elements. Likewise, famously, of course, with something like the invasion of Sicily. Again, a huge amount of deception work was carried out to convince the Germans that maybe Rhodes or Crete or the Balkans might be the intended target. And of course, all this is designed to dissipate enemy forces. I mean, that's the key thing, is to try and convince enemy commanders you're going to attack somewhere else because they're going to have to divert troops
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
counter that threat, because they believe it's real. And of course, that's the other thing with deception. It has to be credible. It has to be
Yeah.
believable. You've got to do it in such a way that you do dupe your opponent.
What would you say was the most successful deception in the
Um,
Second World War?
well, in terms of the access, probably Operation Barbarossa with Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. It was there to see. Hitler's massing his troops in Prussia and in Western Poland, and it's really clear what's going on. But because, of course, the Soviet Union and Germany had cynically divided Poland between them, Stalin thought Hitler was someone that he could do business with. And Hitler reassured Stalin that actually he wasn't going to attack the Soviet Union, and actually moving his troops eastward was all part of a deception to lull Churchill and Britain into a false sense of security and lower their guard, ready for the conduct of Operation Sea Lion and the invasion of Britain. And Stalin, for whatever reason, believed that, despite the fact that all his own intelligence pointed to the opposite, and
Yeah.
likewise his commanders people like Zhukov and Timoshenko, again, fully aware of what's going on. There's this massive troop build-up and the alarm bells are ringing, but Stalin's going, no, we mustn't do anything that will antagonize Hitler. So we're not going to prepare to repel an invasion. And of course, he then suffers the consequences spectacularly, obviously, with the German army getting to the gates of Moscow.
In what kind of ways do the Allies make those lies, those deceptions, believable?
Well, quite often what you would do is you would use a prominent figure which would add credibility. So something like Monty's double in the run-up to D-Day. They got this actor who bore a striking resemblance to Monty, just swan around the Mediterranean on visits, knowing full well that German spies would report that back to Berlin. And if Monty's swanning around the Mediterranean, that would indicate that maybe that the Allies are planning, this is post-Italy, Italy. Maybe the Allies are planning another operation in the Med somewhere. So that deception has credibility because, of course, they think that the double is the real thing. In fact, the chap did a number of things that gave him away, and he ended up getting called home again. And then likewise with D-Day, the Allies in the run-up to D-Day, they created this thing called the First US Army Group, so FUSAG. And to give that added credibility, they put Patton in charge. The Germans are well aware of Patton because of North Africa and Sicily. And what they did was they created this completely fake headquarters, which was supported by radio trucks, which would drive around, East Anglia and Eastern England, emanating orders and things. You then have this mass dummy effort. So you've got inflatable tanks and plywood landing craft and fake airfields, all these things in Eastern England, which seem to indicate that the Allies are going to land. They're either going to cross the Pas de Calais, so at Dover, because that's the shortest point, indicates that the invasion is going to take place there and not further west in Normandy. And likewise, they did a similar operation in northern Scotland, where they created another fake army, which suggested to the Germans that there would be an Allied landing in Norway. So all this is kind of, funnily enough, actually, Hitler did it at the 11th hour, did actually deduct that the Allies were going to land in Normandy. But the added value of all those deception operations was he never believed that was the full Allied effort. He thought that Overlord actually was a feint, that the main attack would come somewhere else, and that the Allies had landed in Normandy. Initially, he thought this to draw his troops west and away from the real invasion point. So it shows you how credible the Germans took those threats, and so it was greatly helped by the fact that Patton was actually there on the ground. So again, what they famously did was at one point they had a generals exchange, and a number of German generals were sent back to Germany in exchange for some of ours. And as part of the deception operation, those generals were driven through FUSAG's preparation areas, because the Allies knew full well when they got back to Berlin and were debriefed, they would say, we've seen this massive build up and we've seen all these trucks under, camouflage netting and tanks, and, we've heard that Patton's in charge. They're all added to this illusion. It all came under something called Operation Fortitude. There were actually, I'm going from memory here, but there was something like a dozen different deception operations. All coming under Operation Fortitude, and Operation Bodyguard, which were designed to convince the Germans that the invasion was going to take place anywhere other than Normandy. So a massive amount of deception work took place, which actually ensured D-Day was, as successful as it was, because, again, crucially for the Germans, they remained convinced that the Allies would land north of the Seine somewhere. So for a long time, Hitler refused to release his infantry divisions east of the river, because he thought they would be needed to repel a seaborne invasion somewhere else. And the crux of that was, of course, what it ended up was, it meant the bulk of Hitler's panzer divisions lacked infantry support during much of the Normandy fighting. They didn't have as many infantry divisions supporting them as they might have liked, which of course denied Hitler's panzers greater flexibility, because they were tied down a lot of the time.
It's not a small thing, is it? It's like deception is not a small operation. It's huge, isn't it?
No, and there have been certainly in the case of D-Day, there have been a number of very good books written on it.
Mm,
And again, people's focus tends to be the landings and subsequent Normandy
yeah.
campaign, which it had its good moments and it had its bad moments. But what people don't tend to realize is just the level of duplicity that had gone
Mm,
on to dupe the Germans into not believing that Operation Overlord was actually the real thing, that it was, as I say, some sort of feint. So it actually was very, very key. So particularly Fusag. I mean, Fusag worked a treat. It wasn't until Patton arrived in Normandy in August and takes command of the US Third Army that I think in Berlin the penny begins to drop that maybe Patton's turned up in Normandy and is actually now pushing west into Brittany. So the whole Fusag thing actually was a lie. But of course, by early August, the Germans are beginning to lose in Normandy anyway.
yeah.
Famously the Patton breaks out, and then of course the Germans end up stuck in the pocket by mid-August. So those it shows you how well those deception plans work because they kept the Germans tied down for such a long time and sort of almost forced them to fight with one arm tied behind their backs, if you like, because they had so many problems they were trying to juggle, not realizing actually Normandy was it for the Allies, that it was all or nothing. There wasn't going to be another major amphibious assault
Mm,
or indeed a subsidiary one somewhere well, I tell a lie. Of course, there was going to be there was supposed to be one in parallel, which was Operation Dragoon in the French Riviera, in the south of France, and that was again, of course, that's tied down German troops, but actually, Dragoon and Overlord were supposed to have taken place at the same time, but lack of resources meant that Dragoon didn't take place until mid-August, by which time most of the better units in the south of France have been drawn north to Normandy and have been defeated anyway, in many ways. But it did force the Germans again to commit large numbers of troops to the French Mediterranean coast.
What do you think it was the main difference between the Allied deception and the German deception?
Um, the Allies were a lot better at it, and they had to be quite often because of the sheer scale of their operations. Deception operations of all shapes and sizes took place throughout the war, both on Western and Eastern fronts and in North Africa. But ultimately, the Allies were better at it, particularly once the initiative had passed to them, because of course the onus then was to try and convince the Germans that an attack would take place somewhere else than the intended area. Um, I mean, I say Barbarossa certainly for the Germans worked, and also of course certainly 40 to 41 Hitler's Blitzkrieg. A lot of that was based on bluff. I mean, he literally overran most of Western Europe and a big chunk of Eastern Europe, um, largely through bamboozling his enemies, and acting very very quickly. So that worked well. And again, likewise, well, it depends on whether you believe or not believe Operation Sea Lion actually was a real operation. Did Hitler
Yeah.
intend actually an amphibious assault across the Channel? I firmly believe he didn't, which makes, of course, the Blitz and the Black Battle of Britain a bluff because he desperately wanted to beat Britain to the negotiating table without having to invade it. Because, of course, all along his master plan was the invasion of the Soviet Union to carve out living space, for the German population that he wanted. Western Russia, he wanted Belarus and the Ukraine because they had space, and in the case of Ukraine, it's Soviet Union's breadbasket. That was his long-term goal. Really, he didn't want to go to war with Britain and France anyway, but of course, because of his attack on Poland, that had committed Britain and France to the
Mm.
Second World War. So Hitler was obliged to invade France because obviously they've got a mutual border. But when it came to Britain, did he really intend it? I don't think he did. And it's important to remember, of course, in 1940 and early 41, amphibious warfare didn't really exist.
Mm.
It wasn't on par with what we later see for Sicily and Normandy and in the Pacific. The Germans simply did not have landing craft. They were going to use Rhineland coal barges, which are designed for inland waterways. They got these heavy steel coal barges, cut the front off them, sort of put a ramp on. But you think, well, if the weather had been rough in the channel, or the RAF or the Navy had intervened, would these things ever have got across the
Mm.
channel? Again, folklore history is that the threat was very real. Well, probably for a time it was. And again, to be fair, Hitler did mass, an invasion force in France for a while, until such time as, of course, he then needed to redeploy east to attack the Soviet Union.
Because didn't he get to Jersey? Didn't the
Yes,
Nazis
yeah,
get to
yeah,
Jersey?
the only bit of the United Kingdom was occupied
Yeah.
was the Channel Islands, but of course that's because of their proximity to the French coast.
Mm.
I mean, another prime example of deception, which lots of people aren't really aware of, is for Japan. It was the strike north or the strike south, and of course, Japan had invaded China, so and occupied
Hmm.
much of Manchuria. And in 1939, on the very cusp of the Second World War, and picked a fight with the Soviet Union and lost quite spectacularly
Hmm.
at a place called Khalkhin Gol. It enabled General Zhukov to earn his spurs, if you like, because he learned how to conduct an all arms operation, using tanks, artillery, infantry, and aircraft against the Japanese. But the Japanese had unfinished business. So for them,
Mm.
they're going to resume their border war with the Soviet Union, try and take out Mongolia, which had been their original plan, which would have created an additional buffer for them against the Soviet Union. Or were they going to switch south, and strike against the colonial power, so Britain, France, the Netherlands, and America and the Philippines? Um, and they conducted this blinding thing that for ages everyone thought that they were massing to strike north, whereas actually, of course, they struck south and caught everyone by surprise. They end up overrunning Southeast Asia and a big chunk of the Pacific, and then also, of course, catch the Americans by surprise
Hmm.
at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing with that is that the Americans are actually eavesdropping on the Japanese in much the way that Bletchley Park was on the Germans and the Italians. Um, and they'd cracked Japanese naval codes, but at the very point that the Japanese were about to attack Pearl Harbor, they changed those codes. Um, Americans had cracked. I'm going from memory. I think it was the Purple Code, which is what it was the cipher that Japanese diplomats used to communicate with their embassies.
Hmm.
And the Americans were reading that, so they were aware that something big was about to happen because they were warning all their embassies. But the problem they had was at that stage, which was a problem both for the Allies and the Axis, is that intelligence wasn't very joined up. So Admiral Kimmel's CNC fleet, Hawaii, does not get tipped off that something big's going to happen. The American intelligence was also aware that Japanese had been snooping around the naval facilities, probably with a view to mapping out Pearl Harbor and the location of warships. So the warning signs were there, but unfortunately they weren't shared in a timely manner. One of the
Mm.
problems that the Americans had with their eavesdropping was they didn't have any deciphering facilities in Hawaii. So everything had to be sent back to Washington to be deciphered and then sent back. And of course, that delay, and
Yeah.
also who they were sharing it with as well, it caused problems. Now, those sorts of problems as the war progressed were ironed out. Prime example of that is that Bletchley Park actually had um, liaison groups embedded with senior Allied field commanders. Um,
Ah.
so they were so I always like to cite Patton. Everyone says,
Mm.
"Oh, Patton, he was a seat of the pants general, complete nightmare, did everything on impulse." And you go, "Well, actually, particularly when it came to Normandy, he was being fed Lorenzen Enigma decrypts, so he was
Mm.
acting from a position of strength. He knew that his cards were stacked in his favour. So something like the breakout into Brittany, he knew that the Germans didn't really have the strength to cut off his breakout." So
Mm.
actually, while we go, well, that's pretty risky, wasn't it? And actually he was being fed pretty good intelligence
Mm.
about German intentions and German capabilities. But again, it wasn't until the 1970s that the true level of what Bletchley had done and how it was helping the battle on the ground. Its contribution was, it took a long time because it was so secret. It took a long time for it to come out just quite what its impact was. I've seen a figure. They reckon that will actually probably help shorten the Second World War by about 2 years.
Oh
So you
wow.
so you imagine if it had dragged on until
Yeah.
1940, just um, so it which is not to say it didn't have problems. I mean, the sheer volume of
Hmm.
radio intercepts it got, its ability to, because of course the codes kept changing as well. That sort of thing. Of course, there was this constant war of wills. Every time the Germans made a change to Enigma, that it would have to be
Mm.
broken again. That was a particular problem with German naval ciphers, because of course it meant the Battle of the Atlantic ebbed and flowed, dependent on how well the Allies were being informed on U-boat intentions. So initially the U-boats run amok, then they've got better intelligence on what they're doing. The Germans then change their ciphers. Again, there's a period when the Allies are operating in the Atlantic pretty much blind because they don't know what the Germans are doing. So there's this kind of, with the eavesdropping war, it was sort of seesaw war because it kept changing depending on at what stage either side was at reading the other's communications.
And how did the intelligence from those codes work with the spies on the ground?
Um, well, something like so. For instance, the one of the difference between the Allies were pretty good at espionage,
Hmm.
and very very good at countering espionage. The Germans were pretty good on espionage, but not so good on counter espionage. Prime example of that for Britain is something called the double cross. You know, we managed to capture about 120 or so German agents, uh, and over about I think it's 25 or so of them were turned, hence double
Hmm.
cross. So they became double agents, and what they did was they were able to feed fake intelligence back to Berlin. And of course, one of the ways of knowing whether or not that was working would then be reading Enigma or the Lorenz codes to see what German traffic was saying about that intelligence that was collected. Um, I'm just trying to think. So someone like Eddie Chapman, with the double cross, uh, you know, gets recruited by the Germans and then is recruited back by us. So he double crosses the Germans, comes to Britain with a mission to blow up an aircraft factory, but in order to keep him as a credible source of feeding fake intelligence to Germans, he actually needs to carry out his operation. So what they do is they mock up some photos of this blown up aircraft factory, which convinces that Eddie Chapman did his job. He gets recalled to Germany, and I think he was the only British civilian spy that gets the Iron Cross, for something he never did. But of course, the deception in convincing the Germans actually he'd done what he'd been sent to do worked, which is why they rewarded him. I mean, it's fascinating with spies because they did it for a lot of different reasons. Normally you would think they're just being patriots, but a lot of them did it for the money. In the case of the Soviet Union, lots of them did it for ideology. Uh, and quite a few of them just did it for the sheer excitement. Um, Particularly with something like the SOE for the British Special Operations Executive, a lot of people were involved in that sort of work because they found it exciting. They felt they were contributing to the war effort. But I think, and let's face it, being an agent is very, very dangerous because if you're caught, two things will happen to you.
Yeah. It.
You'll be tortured, so they find out who your contacts are,
Mhm.
and then shot. You know,
Yeah.
or if you're lucky, you might be able to persuade them that you're going to work for them, in which case you become a double or a triple agent. Um, in terms of espionage, so for instance, with France, shortly after France was overrun, the spy networks in France were a complete disaster because they operated networks which were not isolated. So, of course, if the Germans caught one agent, they would torture them and they would roll up the entire network. It took time to realize that you would have a network made up of different cells that had no contact with each other. So it'd be
Mm.
two people, uh, lots of these dotted around, which would create a network, but the network couldn't be aware of the other groups within the network because if they were caught, they would compromise it. And I say a lot of in the early days of France, a lot of agent networks were simply rolled up because quite often they were family based. You
Yeah.
have French families or French emigres from Britain that would go back to France, and they would use friends and family, which of course in the long term was
Mm.
not a good idea because
No.
if one was caught, they, most people can't withstand severe torture, so they would betray the network and they'd all get arrested. So it took a long time to realize that actually, you might have an agent and his handler, but that's as far as it goes. Nobody
Mm.
else within that network must be aware of everyone else because it's that source and agent protection. It becomes paramount.
And how serious was the fear of the fifth columnists, and how did Britain handle it?
Well, I say Britain was very, very good because we rounded up all German agents sent to the UK. So German espionage from the UK was a complete disaster because they just kept getting picked up fairly quickly. I'll say quite a few of them then became double agents. In terms of the Germans penetrating the UK, never very successful.
Mhm.
Uh, Germany obviously was quite difficult to penetrate because it was a police state. So you
Yeah.
had the SD, which was kind of their equivalent of MI5. You had the Gestapo, so it was very, very difficult to place agents within Germany for obvious reasons. In the occupied territories, not so hard, and of course SOE handled agents within the Axis occupied territories, and also inflamed resistance. So
Mhm.
in France, you'd have the resistance, or say Yugoslavia, you'd have the partisans there who are effectively, they're not resistance, they're actually fighting a guerrilla war, full-scale guerrilla war against the occupying forces. So there were lots of different things that, again, the view of SOE is it just handled agents, but of course it didn't. What it did was it became a conduit for weapons and equipment and instructors that would go and help the Greek fighters or the Yugoslav ones, wherever they cropped up. I mean, the Soviet Union did the same thing in the western parts of the Soviet Union that were occupied by the Germans. Moscow became very adept at generating partisan armies behind German lines,
Mhm.
particularly because someone like Belarusia, uh, it's either swamps or forests, both of which are ideal for conducting, guerrilla warfare, because it means the Germans have then got to follow them in. In the case of the Soviet Union, I mean, the partisan war behind German lines, it tied down a huge number of German divisions. I mean, the Germans were forced to recruit what they called security divisions, quite often made up of, older men, school teachers, those sorts of things, whose job was simply to act as police behind the lines to make sure, railway lines were not attacked, local garrison towns were not attacked, telephone lines were not cut. It tied up a huge amount of resources for manpower, which from the German point of view would have been better off fighting the Red Army. But of course, because the Soviets were so good at conducting these guerrilla warfare, and also it became sort of self-fulfilling because the German reaction to the partisans got increasingly brutal, which convinced the local population that they did not want to live under German rule, which in turn would feed, resistance against the occupation even more. You see that in places like Italy and northern Italy, where the Germans occupied northern Italy after the Allies landed in 1943. German exasperation with Italian resistance to the German occupation got to such that they started committing atrocities against the civilian population, which then, of course, convinced the Italians even more they did not want to be, they didn't want the Germans there. Similar situation with France, certainly in the run up to D-Day, the Maquis, the French resistance in southern France went over to open resistance. I mean, they launched a guerrilla war, unfortunately, prematurely, and the Germans proceeded to crush it. But of course, um, when you fight fire with fire, it tends to just breed more fire, and that's one of the problems, in terms of the secret war and the resistance and the partisan wars that went on. They became vicious circles that the Axis forces simply couldn't curtail, and it made their occupation even more unpopular. For the Germans, that was the disaster in places like Belarus and particularly Ukraine, where when the Germans first invaded, a lot of Ukrainians welcomed the Germans as liberators, because they hated
Mhm.
Soviet rule and they'd suffered under collectivization and all the various purges. Hitler played his cards right and promised them independence, post the Soviet Union suing for peace, he could have generated himself some, you know, worthwhile allies, but because of his onerous, racial theories and the fact that you know, the Soviets were Slavs and he despised them, he
Mhm.
by the time he decided to recruit them as possible allies, it was too late. I mean, he didn't really start doing it until 1944, by which time the tide is turning on both the Eastern and the Western fronts.
Fascinating. I could listen to you all day. It's just fascinating.
Sorry, I'm not letting you get a word in edgewise.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I'm just riveted by it all. Can you tell us about Agent Garbo? And
um,
what would you say that was the best double agent?
yes, I mean probably there are a lot of agents. Some of the better ones I'm trying to think of is something like Operation Mincemeat with the dead body.
Mm,
That was very, very clever in that it helped deceive the Germans about the landings in Sicily. So that was an agent, if you like, but a dead one.
mhm, yeah.
um, yeah, I mean there were lots of agents. The impact they had varied enormously. I mean, there's sort of this mythology that's grown up around secret agents, and of course, a lot of them only, no disrespect to what they did because they risked life and limb, but a lot of them only had quite small impacts on the area that they were in. So it depended on where they were. How effective they were overall in the war, I think, is open to debate. I think probably to me, the greater impact was from the eavesdropping operations,
Mm,
the deception operations, and and certainly the resistance. Because as I've just said, it tied down an awful lot of Axis forces. Um, Agents, it again, I say it varied enormously. Now, to be fair to the French, in Northern Europe, they were the sort of things that they did was incredible. So obviously in the run up to D-Day, French agents were spying on the Atlantic Wall and German preparations. So the Allies were well informed on, particularly once Rommel turned up on the scene, to beef up German defences in northwestern France. The Allies were well informed, and then likewise they pulled off some blinders when it came to Hitler's V weapon programs. The resistance got agents into some of those facilities, and on one occasion, I can't remember where the location was, but on one occasion, under the cover of an Allied bombing raid, they actually stole the plans to some of the V2 launch sites.
mm,
So in that instance, that's quite important because it helped advise the Allies for the air campaign against particularly the V1, the flying bomb, because it required a ramp. So initially, when the Germans were building the ramps, the Allies weren't entirely sure what they were for. Now, of
mm,
course, the V2 was a completely different kettle of fish because it's a ballistic rocket and it can be moved about. So it was harder to detect the launch sites for the V2. But the V1, the flying bomb, it needed a ski ramp to take off from. The jet engine on the back of it boosts it, fires it into the sky, and then it's got a guidance system in it, crude guidance system, which will get it to target. So for a while the Allies were scratching their heads because the Germans were building all these production facilities in France, great huge concrete bunkers and the ski ramps, and weren't entirely sure what they were for. So of course, once information started coming in from the resistance, they had a clearer picture. And then, of course, famously in the case of the V2, the Polish underground got their hands on chunks of one of the rockets after it had been test fired. The Polish underground were able to pick up parts of the rocket before the Germans could retrieve it. So again, for someone like Reginald Jones,
mhm.
who was one of the leading figures in British technical intelligence, um, those sorts of things were a windfall for him, because for that's another element of the war, of course, is you forget that there's this constant seesaw of changing technologies, particularly with Hitler, because once he started losing on the battlefield, he kept hoping his wonder weapons would tilt the balance. So he kind of thought he could beat Britain into submission by bombarding London using, the V1 flying bomb and then the V2 rocket, but also in the skies, of course, you've got things like jet engine technology, which the Germans led on. So they produced the Messerschmitt 262, which again he's hoping will shoot Allied bombers out of the skies in sufficient numbers to cause a halt to the Allied strategic bombing campaign. So while all that's going on, of course, the Allies have then got to get intelligence on those technologies, how they work, and how we can counter them. Another example of that is the, again, I touched on it briefly, is something like the Battle of the Beams, where the Germans essentially were using radar beams to guide their bombers to targets in the UK, particularly when they started night bombing. And Jones and the others, the British scientific intelligence, they had to fathom out a way of jamming them, or even better, deflecting them, which would send the bombers, in the wrong direction, back to France or over the Channel or something. So there's this kind of constant technological struggle going on. As I mentioned earlier, it was the same with Enigma. The Germans kept making changes to how the ciphers worked, and that would then leave Bletchley Park in the blind for a bit, until it cracked the latest iteration of the code. So there's this constant sort of, again, as part of the secret war, this constant sort of one-upmanship behind the scenes, trying to get a technological edge over each other.
Thank you. How important was this intelligence and spies in places like North Africa and we've touched a bit on the Italian campaigns, but the Italian campaigns as well?
Yeah, I mean, they were quite important. As I touched on Monty's double earlier, he turned up in North Africa, knowing full well that in North Africa there was still a lot of German spies on the loose. So knowing full well that he would be seen. So that was part and parcel. And then likewise, the Allies did a series of deception operations in the Mediterranean where they wanted to try and convince the Germans that the Allies were going to land maybe on Crete. So they created this thing called, I think it was 12th Army, a dummy army in Egypt, in the Cairo area, and then started gathering landing craft along the coast. A lot of it was dummies, but knowing full well that Nazi spies would see these preparations and feed them back to Berlin. So again, it's part of that sort of grand deception operation that's going on. You kind of think, well, if they've got enemy agents in North Africa, why are we not rounding them up? And you go, well, actually, it's better off to leave them there causing mischief if we can mislead them into feeding fake intelligence back to Germany. And again, Al Alamein is again prime example of a big deception operation that was designed to deceive Rommel. So Operation Bertram, they created all these fake concentration areas in the desert to convince Rommel that the Eighth Army was bigger. And then they built again these dummy tank and artillery depots to the south to convince Rommel that Monty was going to attack in the south and not in the north. And one of the great stories of that is that they built a fake oil pipeline. And basically what they did was they got tin cans, they dig this long trench, knowing full well that Luftwaffe would probably fly over it and photograph it. They put all these cans in so it would look like pipeline, and then overnight they would bury that section and then dig another section westwards, and they kept doing that. I can't remember what the length of the pipeline was, but they kept doing it. British sappers, poor souls, out in the baking desert sun, constantly filling in and digging this trench. There's nothing in it, but of course the Germans were then convinced that Monty's building this massive pipeline south, which could only mean one thing, that his tanks are going to be there because they'll need fuel. So it's, again, it helped. Basically, it forced Rommel to divide up his armored units, rather than concentrating them in the one point that he thought Monty would attack. He kind of had to divide up his tank forces, which for him was not helpful when it came to launching a counterattack, because his troops are all over the shop. But that's part of there's a chap called Dudley Clark, who oversaw all these things. Hugely successful in duping. I mean, really, probably the Operation Bertrand's up there, I think, with Operation Fortitude and the D-Day deception. Maybe not quite on such a a big scale, but of course it greatly helped Monty ensure that Rommel had dissipated his forces along the entire front facing Eighth Army, which of course when Monty finally gets round to launching his own counter-offensive, um, Rommel's not in a good position to fend it off. I mean, I remember a story that Churchill, who was always in a hurry, to get things done, and in the early days of the war, that quite often was detrimental. So, browbeating his generals to launching attacks in 1941, which were not ready and defeated. And after Churchill, Monty replaced Auchinleck, Churchill kept urging Montgomery on, saying, you've got to attack now. We've got all these tanks shipped in from America. Eighth Army's in a good place. It's trained. Its men are fit. Let's go. And Monty basically said to Churchill, I don't tell you how to run the war. You don't tell me how to run the battle. And if you're not happy with what I'm doing, you're more than welcome to replace me. He called
Wow.
Churchill's bluff. And Churchill kind of went, no, that's fine. Carry on doing what you're doing. And of course, the rest is history, because Monty then wins one of those linchpin battles of the Second War at El Alamein, which helps turn the tide in North Africa.
Well, we've talked about a lot of the techniques and spies, etc., and deceptions. Do you think that different techniques were needed in the different theatres, like in Europe and in the Pacific?
I think overall not. A lot depended on the geography. I mean, that clearly would impact on the success of a particular deception operation, because where you're trying to convince the enemy you're going to attack, it's got to be credible. Now, you could argue, Norway, did the Germans really believe we were going to land there? Well, I think they did, but logically, the Germans would have gone, well, the Allies tried it in 1940 with Narvik and Trondheim, and it was all a disaster. Are they really going to attack Norway again? But that worked. But on the whole, trying to convince the Germans that we were going to cross at Dover because it was the shortest point to the continent, that was convincing for the Germans, because it made geographical and strategic sense that you want to get to the Seine as quickly as possible, because once you're north of the Seine, we're then heading for the Rhine and we can get to the Ruhr. So for the Germans, strategically that made sense. Again, in China, well, it was difficult in China because, of course, Manchuria, the Japanese could switch north or south quite easy because there was a major railway system in Manchuria. So for that, it was quite easy for the Japanese to deceive people, because all they needed to do was start putting troops on trains in certain directions, and it would convince you that they were going to do it. And in the terms of the Pacific, well, the American war effort there didn't really need to deceive the Japanese, because of course they just island hopped. Basically it was a war of attrition to get closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, from where America could then start bombing Japan's cities. Because if you think in the case of Japan, the strategic air campaign against Japan doesn't really start until 1944. Whereas it had been underway well before that against Germany. So again, geography affects the enemy's perception of what your plans are. You can only deceive them if that, like I say, certainly in the Mediterranean, of course, it was quite alluring to believe that the Allies might, try and capture Rhodes because it would make a good air base, or Crete because it would make a good air base. That's the other thing that shaped a lot of strategic thinking was, aircraft radius for fighters and bombers. Where would be a good place to capture, because of course that increases your air cover footprint to enable you to attack targets. And that was one of the reasons was the sort of Germans clung on in the Med, because it kept for a while the Allies away from, say, somewhere like Romania and Romania's oil fields, which were vital to the German war effort.
Thank you. And we've talked about Operation Barbarossa a couple of times, and talking about differences. Was there a difference between how the deception of the Germans and the deception of the Soviets on the Eastern Front?
I mean, on the whole, those deception techniques, work for everyone.
Mhm.
In the case of, say, something like Kursk, um, the the Germans kind of ignored all the warning signs.
Mhm.
So, when Hitler launched Operation Citadel with a view to nipping off the Red Army's bulge on the front line there, he wanted to nip it off from the north and south and trap the Red Army forces in a giant pocket. Of course, and they were well aware that the Red Army was massing troops to the east of the pocket, which they
Mhm.
assumed would fight their way through and relieve them. What they ignored the fact was that, of course, that the Red Army was also massing to the north and south of the shoulders on the Kursk. So, of course, what the Russians planned to do was fight Hitler to a standstill at Kursk. And once that happened, they would then go over to the offensive and create an even bigger salient from the north and south, designed to, envelop the Kursk bulge,
Mhm.
and also liberate a number of major Soviet cities. Um, so they did a good job, actually, of convincing the Germans that the fight was only kind of going to be in Kursk. If they'd looked further north, they should have, alarm bells should have been ringing that actually, if we attack the Kursk salient, we're going to be driving ourselves into a hole, basically, which is what they did. You know, the Red Army held them; they almost broke through, but of course, once they'd exhausted themselves, the tank forces being mustered to the east counterattack, and then they also launched major counteroffensives on the shoulder. So again, in terms of deceiving the Germans as to where the main blow would fall, hugely successful. And again, lots of people don't realise that Bletchley Park played a part in Stalin's victory at Kursk, because Churchill passed Bletchley intelligence over to the Russians.
All right.
We gave them a full order of battle for the German army groups that were involved, because obviously we were reading their signals.
Oh wow.
But the only trouble with that is that the problem that Churchill had, and indeed Churchill tried to warn Stalin in June 1941 about the invasion. But the problem Churchill always had was he didn't want to let Stalin know that we were reading uh, encrypted German signals. So on both occasions, he told Stalin that information had come from spies, and Stalin detested spies. He thought they were traitors, thought they were lowest of the low. So usually would dismiss that intelligence out of hand. Now, to be fair, in 1943 at Kursk, the intelligence that we were feeding the Soviets pretty much matched what they were collecting under their own steam, because
Mhm.
obviously they had their own intelligence gathering assets and they were doing their own battlefield eavesdropping. So it kind of confirmed what they already knew. And likewise, we passed them information on the use of newer technologies. The German, the introduction of the Panther tank and the Elephant tank destroyer, all that sort of thing. So scientifically, the Russians were given a heads up on what information we had. So again, it shows you how, in terms of Kursk, deception and eavesdropping all played a part to ensure a Red Army victory, which, like El Alamein, of course, we now all see as a turning point. Because from that point on, the Germans are unable to launch a major counteroffensive or major offensive on the Eastern Front. Because they've expended the backbone of their armored forces. And then, of course, come 1944, when Stalin launches his own version of D-Day with Operation Bagration,
Mhm.
designed to liberate Belarusia from German occupation, the Russians again conduct deception operations to convince the Germans actually that they're going to attack in the south in Ukraine. Um, so it means when he does attack Army Group Centre, it's got very, very few tanks, because the bulk of German armour has been sent south to repel what they think is going to be a major attack. Whereas, of course, it actually takes place opposite Minsk. Um, and in very short order, within a matter of weeks, Army Group Centre collapses um, and faces the surprise attack, and the Red Army reaches the gates of Warsaw. So again, you can see how important
Mhm.
deception is, because the Germans had to make a gamble because they've got limited resources. Is it a strike in Belarusia, or is it a strike in Ukraine? And they went, balance of probabilities, Ukraine. So we'll send most of our armored forces south to support the army group, whatever it was, army group Ukraine or army group North Ukraine. We'll send reinforcements to help them. Whereas actually the blow comes in the middle against, again, a bulge. That's what they called the Belarusian balcony. The Germans had this bulge in the line, which Hitler's general kept pleading him to flatten it out. They said, because our troops are sticking out eastwards, we should flatten out the front line. But of course, because it was anathema to Hitler to give ground, he wouldn't let them withdraw, which of course again contributed to their defeat.
It's not good versus evil, bum bum bum, and
no, and I think I said to you earlier,
everything behind the curtain.
Yeah, well, I think I said to you, as I said to you earlier, the thing with being a historian or military historian is to give events context, but as also it's to look at events either side of it. I always see my job is to try and distill stuff. That's what I try and do in my books. Is to distill events in a hopefully enjoyably, readable way, but also to distill events to try and make them digestible.
Definitely.
Nothing is ever black and white or simple, but it's to try and evenly weigh all the different factors that contribute to a military victory and make them interesting at the same time. Like I say, with something like Bagration, again, here in the West, not many people. It's had more prominence in recent years because of the anniversary of D-Day and what have you. But of course, a lot of people simply don't realise actually that Stalin launched his own version of D-Day 2 or 3 weeks after D-Day. It was supposed to coincide, but for one reason or other, he wasn't ready in time, and literally tore the heart out of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. I mean, Operation Bagration really is the final victory, if you like, for Stalin in terms of the Germans never being able to turn the tide. From that point on, particularly from August 44, once they get to Warsaw, the Germans are able to slow down things and stabilize the front line, but they're never able to launch a large enough counteroffensive to drive the Russians back. Tactically, they achieve small scale victories, but Bagration basically, I mean, the losses were enormous. It's something like 650,000 with Bagration and the supporting operations that the Red Army captured. So, for Hitler to try and replace 500,000 men, it was impossible. It's widely accepted that the Wehrmacht was bled dry on the Eastern Front. I mean, that's where the bulk of the German forces were, and the bulk of their losses take place.
I spoke to Prit Buttar about Operation Bagration a few weeks ago, and it was fascinating.
He's done a book on it recently, hasn't he? And who else did one? David Dimbleby, was it? I think's done one.
Yeah, David Dimbleby did one.
Yeah. So it's getting more prominence now. As people realise its significance. Because certainly on the Eastern Front, of course, the Western interest tends to be Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Kursk. But actually, and I suppose Berlin, actually, because once the Red Army's in Berlin, that really is the end of the Second World War. But there are many other operations on the Eastern Front that people aren't aware of. It's like Hitler's foolhardy invasion of the Caucasus, trying to get to Baku. What was he thinking? Or likewise overrunning the Crimea. His on the Eastern Front, his strategic goals just grew and grew and grew, and he ended up completely lacking focus. He ends up on this sort of will-o'-the-wisp hunt for raw materials. I mean, to my mind, certainly on the Eastern Front, it's his failure to take Moscow. He should have done that. Ignore everything else, take Moscow, because that could have caused a political crisis in the Soviet Union. There's a possibility that Stalin might have been replaced, and in that vacuum, Soviet Union might have sued for peace. I mean, because the best scenario for Hitler was he could occupy the Soviet Union, west of the Urals. But I mean, ultimately, of course, the Soviet Union would still exist east of the Urals, and the Red Army would rearm, re-equip, and bide its time until such a day that it could launch a a counteroffensive to liberate Western Russia. So, but Hitler lost interest in Moscow and then ended up, focusing on Leningrad and then on Stalingrad and then trying to get to Baku, and it just he kind of lost all strategic focus, thankfully, because of course it
Yeah.
contributed to his defeat.
And out of all this, the spies and the deception, were there any, and I'm sure there were, ethical or moral lines crossed?
I mean, yeah, almost certainly all the time. I mean, the problem with clandestine warfare is it tends not to be governed by the rule of law,
Hmm.
and that's quite often when atrocities happen.
Yeah.
Should civilians, it's a grey area. Should civilian resistors or partisans, how would you treat them if they assassinated, a military leader? It's like the Czechs killing Heydrich in
Hmm.
Prague. What's the legal standpoint on that? It gets a bit grey, and then it's likewise anyone in civilian clothes caught with a gun will be treated as a spy. I mean, that tended to be the German response.
Hmm.
So it is a very grey area, and as we discussed earlier, it's very, very dangerous area as well,
Yeah.
because you won't be accorded the rules of the Geneva Convention. So at least if you're caught in a uniform, you should be treated as a prisoner of war, held in a camp, and looked after to a certain degree. But if you're if you're a civilian partisan, or if you're wearing partial uniform, the rules of law are not going to be applied to you. You're going to be treated as a spy or a traitor, and you will be shot. So um, certainly with the guerrilla wars, as I was saying earlier, that I can't remember what the German formula was, but it was something like, they got to the stage where they would, well, if you kill one of ours, we'll shoot 15 of yours.
Yeah.
It got that vicious, and it's because war movies tend to sort of glamorize guerrilla warfare, because you see them
Hmm.
blowing up bridges and oil pipelines, and you go, well, that's fine, but there will be a backlash. You
Yeah.
know, whatever you do, there will be a reaction, usually not governed by the rules of law. Prime example of that, of course, is Aradour in France, when the Second SS are trying to march north to assist the German defence in Normandy, and the French resistance make their progress a real misery.
Hmm.
Blowing up stuff and derailing trains. So the SS just, start massacring villages to make an example, and they're killing civilians. So you shouldn't be killing civilians, but as far as they're concerned, the civilian population may be hiding combatants, so you have to make an example of them. So um, the secret war does engender a breakdown, I think, in the rule of law, and
Hmm.
also encourages atrocities. Now you could argue, well, really, there are no rules in war. You fight to
Yeah.
win. It's total warfare. Um, we always struggle with that. Oh, was somehow, war is conducted in a civilized way. Well, of course, that's complete nonsense. But they are. There has to be some sort of restrictions in terms of, the rule of law, terms of engagement, who you can and can't shoot, all these sorts of things. But it becomes very blurred, um,
Yeah.
you know, during wartime.
Yeah. And it's
It's like in the Battle of the Atlantic. Where do you stand on the U-boats sinking merchant ships?
yeah.
Because they're manned by merchant sailors. They're not combatants. Some of the ships might have guns on, for anti-aircraft purposes. I suspect in the early stages of the war, a lot of them would not have any weapons on. But the Germans would go, well, they're carrying tanks, or they're carrying artillery, or they're carrying foodstuffs. We're trying to strangle, the British war effort. We're going to sink them. But in doing that, you're then killing civilians because it's their civilian crews. So it's
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say the same about the British and Americans with the Dresden bombing and
yeah,
the firebombing of Japan as well.
it's it's notable at the end of the Second World War, no senior Luftwaffe commanders were tried for war crimes in terms of the Blitz.
Yeah.
Because we were not able to take the moral high ground on that, because what we had visited on Germany and Japan was,
Mm,
100-fold greater. So, um, but with something like the strategic bomber campaign, you have to go, well, kind of, to be fair, they were making it up as they went along. That had not been tried before.
mm,
So the question was, can you beat a country into submission by bombing them? Uh, Now, you might have thought, should we have not looked at the Blitz and the fact that it just made Britain more belligerent, that we're not going to be
yeah.
beaten into submission? Would the Germans not take the same attitude? And the other problem, of course, that you had with something like the strategic bomber campaign, the targeting was just not sufficient to make it pinpoint. I mean, even
Mm,
today we have trouble with precision guided munitions. Civilians get killed, but then you know particularly with the RAF, you'd have this kind of creeping, carpet of bombs that would start some distance from the factory and move in. And then, of course, like with us, like our reference merchant seamen, we're of the view, well, factory workers are collateral damage in terms of shutting down production, then we'll bomb the factory workers' homes.
yeah.
Unfortunate fact of that was, of course, you weren't just killing Germans. Quite often it was, Italian, Czech, Pole, whoever, slave labor that had been
Yeah.
shipped to Germany to work in those factories. So again, it becomes a grey area on. I mean, certainly
Yeah.
with something like we're going off subject slightly, but certainly in terms of strategic bomber campaign, you can see Churchill began to get sort of cold feet on his support for it
Mm,
as the war started coming to an end, because he knew morally, we didn't have a leg to stand on. I mean,
yeah.
even he during the 20s and 30s, when air power was just becoming a thing, had warned about, what was the morality of flattening cities. There was none. And yet, you know, the needs of war had actually required, Britain and America to conduct these major air campaigns in an effort to shut down their factories. I often, say this to people. The irony is for the strategic bomber campaign, it's by the end of the war, the Germans were running out of raw materials rather than industrial capacity.
Mm,
The thing that was crippling them was that they were running out of oil and or iron ore and nickel and all those sorts of things that they needed to build stuff. Albert Speer, the Nazi armaments minister, had warned Hitler, that we're just running out of stuff, that the factories are going to grind to a halt because we simply
yeah.
do not have the raw materials anymore. That was really the pinch point for Nazi Germany.
Well, finally, as an intelligence officer yourself, how did that influence the writing of Secret War?
Well, good question. I'd like to think it gave me an appreciation for the intelligence war. I mean, every war there's an intelligence aspect to it,
Hmm.
because it's that sort of Sun Tzu art of war mantra of know your enemy. So there's always that element of really generals are reliant on intelligence. For you
Yeah.
to conduct a military operation, you really have got to know full capabilities of your enemy. Um, and in terms of something like D-Day, it was planned to the last detail. When you think what casualties of detail, for D-Day, it's something like 10,000. Well, we were expecting 100 times that. So the 10,000 is not great. But you go, basically, we traded a division for a bridgehead in occupied Europe. That's not bad going, is it? That's
Yeah.
because our intelligence was immaculate. Our preparations were pretty much flawless because we built artificial harbours. We had all the specialised armour. We had the airborne operations to secure the flanks. All those sorts of things. And that meticulous planning, of course, was backed by really good intelligence, because we needed to know how quickly will the Germans react.
Yeah.
And they didn't react quick enough, thankfully for the Allies, on D-Day. Whereas something like Arnhem, which goes horribly wrong, is because the Germans reacted really quickly.
Mm,
We underestimated them, and we also underestimated the intelligence we had, because our intelligence, in the case of Arnhem, on the SS units, there was pretty good, but we thought they were spent. They were about to go
yeah.
home back to Germany to be refitted. So Montgomery very unwisely underestimated what the reaction would be to Operation Market Guard, and particularly the presence of the British powers at Arnhem. The intelligence was quite good, but he kind of ignored it. But whereas in Normandy, we were well aware that the Germans had this really muddled chain of command. So they had this thing called Panzer Group West, which would command all the armoured units in northwest France. It would be the focal headquarters for launching a major armoured counterattack against the Allies. So that posed a severe threat to the Allies, but they had to get authorization to release forces. Some of the units were east of the River Seine, so they couldn't conduct any operations without Hitler's permission. And also, of course, the Panzer Group West answered to von Rundstedt as CNC West. So you can see you've immediately got this three-way muddle that slows down their reactions.
Yeah.
And like with the Allied war effort, we knew where what's his name, General Treppenberg, I think it was, commander of Panzer Group West. We knew where his headquarters was and bombed it. So paralyzed it as a command and control structure. So it had been set up to help defend against an Allied amphibious assault. And at the very moment they needed it, we took it out of the equation by bombing the headquarters, blowing up all the radio trucks, killing a lot of staff. I think Treppenberg was injured. So again, that took him out of the equation. So again, but that's all down to good intelligence. It's, as you've said, it's complex. It's like ultimately, it's like a game of chess. You've got to try and guess what your opponent's next move is, and the better you understand chess, the better you can predict your opponent's moves. And warfare is a bit like that. It for all parties involved, it takes a while to get the lie of the land, suss how an enemy army operates, all those sorts of things. But ultimately, what you're doing needs to be underpinned by good intelligence, and that good intelligence then helps you deceive the enemy, and also because your intelligence then feeds into being able to read intelligence. Because another thing I pointed out, of course, within the German high command there was resistance. Obviously you have the July 44 bomb plot to try and kill Hitler, so there were senior commanders that were kind of doing what they could within Germany to derail the German war effort. We mentioned earlier it was very, very difficult for civilian resistors or foreign agents to operate in Germany because it was a highly efficient police state. But the head of the German communications systems, I can't remember his name, but he was in charge of all German military radio traffic, and Enigma was actually feeding intelligence via agents in Switzerland to Stalin. So again, I mentioned earlier that Churchill fed him Stalin intelligence. Well, Stalin was also getting it from the Germans, from an agent, if you like, senior general within their comms system, who was also feeding via the Red Orchestra in, I think, Zurich, was it? Via them back to Stalin. So, again, Stalin had multiple sources all telling him the same thing through different sources. So you think, having a traitor in the heart of your communications organization is not great, but
no.
I think General Phil Giebel, I'm going from memory, but yeah, he detested the Nazi regime and didn't want them to win, so felt that anything he could do to derail the German war effort actually would lead to the downfall of the Nazis. So there was a select few Germans that wanted rid of Hitler. Most of the assassination plots that never ever worked because Hitler had this charmed life. But most of the assassination plots against him, they funnily enough emanated from Army Group Center in operating in the Soviet Union. A lot of those staff officers that rotated through the headquarters of Army Group Center actually were dissenters who wanted rid of Hitler, and on a number of occasions attempted, bomb plots, which for one reason or another the bomb didn't go off, or he wasn't on the plane that the bomb was on, all these sorts of things. I mean, fate annoyingly was in Hitler's favor throughout the war. I don't know why, and again, like with the July bomb plot, the table shielded him from the blast. If the satchel with explosives had been a bit further forward, Hitler would have got the full blast of it. He would have been, they would have killed him, and then the war would have taken a different turn. But there were these numerous attempts to kill him, but he just seemed to be gifted when it came to dodging those attempts.
Definitely. And thank you. And I usually ask my guests what they're up to next, but I know you have a book to promote.
Indeed, yes, that came
Rhineland?
out. Yeah, that came out in October.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to launch it at the National Army Museum. Yeah, so it hasn't been out very long.
And have you any more in the pipeline?
Um, Funnily enough, in terms of the Secret War, I'm just doing a follow-up for that publisher called Nazi Hunters.
Oh, right.
Um, Subject I didn't really know much about, but obviously I know a lot more about it now.
Mhm.
And it looks at the fate of senior Nazis at the end of the Second World War, but pretty much post Nuremberg. I mean, Nuremberg trials and the ancillary trials that went on around it are quite well covered.
Mm.
So what I'm looking at is the hunt for Nazis afterwards. And it's quite a shocker. I mean, the way the Allies behaved is just quite frankly appalling. Now, in part, of course, the gathering Cold War played a part in that. In that, you have something like Operation Paperclip, where the Americans rounded up all the Nazi rocket scientists and took them back to America. The Russians did exactly the same thing. They had a similar program where they hoovered up V1 and V2 scientists for their own rocket programs. And the Germans did, those Germans responsible for war crimes, they did a whole host of different things. So they would make themselves invaluable to the Allies, so they would become agents, because some of them would have access to East Germany, which obviously was occupied by the Soviets, so they could cross the border for a while with freedom. So some of the senior Gestapo people and intelligence people were recruited by British and Americans to spy for them, irrespective of what they'd done during the war. Some of them quite openly lived under their own names at home, and just kept their heads down. Others assumed false names and carried on living in Germany. And then famously, quite a lot fled to Latin America. So they ended up in Brazil and Chile and other places where those regimes had a use for their skills, particularly Gestapo members who are good at running secret police and torturing people. And then likewise, quite a lot ended up in the Middle East. Some went to Egypt and Syria. So Egypt under President Nasser for a while, till Mossad put pay to it, had its own indigenous rocket program. And of course, that was staffed again by Nazi rocket scientists working, in a factory outside Cairo to build Egypt ballistic missiles. So it's just fascinating what happened to them all. Some were brought to trial, but an awful lot of them made themselves useful. I say it is quite shocking. And then I look at the various individuals. Obviously, you've got Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter. And then there's a husband and wife team. It was a French wife, I think, and German husband who, again, during the Cold War years, made a point of outing senior West German politicians because they quite often had Nazi pasts that they'd conveniently forgotten about. So it's a fascinating subject. Now, if the Cold War had not happened, would we have been more diligent? I don't know, but because the problem we had was that I can't remember what the figure was. Ballpark, something like 150,000 Germans were accused of committing war crimes. Well, you just simply could not try all of them. How many are you going to execute? How many are you going to hold in
Mm.
prison? So they tried to keep the trials sort of limited to those responsible for the worst atrocities. So something like the Holocaust, or for waging war, and committing atrocities in the occupied territories. They tried to restrict it to that, and obviously with Nuremberg, it was the trial of all this, Hitler's inner circle, all the senior Nazis. So they tried to restrict it, but of course, you had tens of thousands of others who actually had blood on their hands one way or another. Because arguably the senior rocket scientists, well, the V1 and V2 have been built using slave labor, so they're
Yeah.
complicit. They're complicit in that war crime. But of course, lots of people went, yeah, well, forget about that because you're really good at building rockets. So, so that's my next project. and I'm currently writing that. And then next year, it's at the proof stage. I've done another book on Churchill, which is a pictorial biography. So
Oh
sort of
man.
over 300 images of Churchill related events. It's not all of Churchill, but it's events that he was involved in. Sort of charting, his life and up until death. It's called Winston Churchill Making of a Warlord. So obviously, from my perspective as a military historian, the focus is kind of on his military achievements. But
Yeah.
and I say that's at the proof stage. I've just seen the first proof. Hopefully, I'll see a second proof after Christmas somewhere, and that's due out in May next year.
Well, I will flick through them pictures and see if I can see a picture of my granddad, because he was an MP for Churchill.
Oh, okay, excellent.
So, so I'll try and see if I can spot him.
Yeah.
But
So
today,
was that during the Second World War or during the
yeah, Second World War, yeah,
Second World War?
yeah. But today we have been talking about the Secret War, and I will put a link down below to get that, and I'll put a link down below.
I can hold it up as well.
That, and I'll put a link down below for Vineland as well. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I'd like to say I could have talked to you all day because I was just riveted.
Always happy to come on again. No,
Yeah.
Thank you for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome.
I say it's such a broad brushed topic. It's nice to be able to drill down into some of it.
Yeah, it is. It is. And everybody go get yourself a copy of the book because it's excellent.
Thank you.
So thank you, Anthony, for joining me today. And yes, we'll bring you back on again to talk about one of your other books.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye now. For those of you still with me, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you so much to Anthony Tucker-Jones for coming on to the show. It's a great conversation as always, and I really enjoyed it. Now, that was the last episode of 2025. Season 2 begins in 3 weeks. 3 weeks with my conversation with Dr. Robert Sommer talking about forced sexual labour in Nazi concentration camps. And that comes to you on January the 7th. Also in the new year, the Biographer's Chair podcast begins in earnest with my conversation with Howard Soanes about Fred and Rose West. So 2026 is going to be a mega podcast bonanza for all you guys out there. So keep watching, like and subscribe, and have a great Christmas and a wonderful New Year. See you soon.